Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for sticking around. I know it's been a wonderful day. We've seen a number of really great panels here today and heard from a number of just really fascinating conversations. I'm kind of hoping that this conversation that we'll have here this afternoon, maybe we can get real. We can really kind of hear some things that that hopefully will kind of motivate each of us to see what we can do individually about this question of restoring trust and thinking about the new possibilities and the new realities that we have. So Kesha is here on the panel, but we also have Lou Frankfurt. Everybody welcome Lou. Give Lou a round of applause. I don't want to go a lot into people's backgrounds and details. Because we just heard a little bit about Kesha, I think I should say a little bit about Lou Frankfurt so you all know who he is, which I hope you already know. But so Lou is the Chairman Emeritus of Coach Incorporated. How many of you have a Coach product? I have one, yes. Okay. Thank you.
About 80%.
So Lou started at Coach in 1979, and at that time the company's sales were about $6 million. And in fact, when he left under his stewardship, when he left in 2013, as of June 2013, Coach's annual sales were over $5 billion. Over $5 billion. So I've learned a little bit about Lou just from reading his background, and many people associate him with Coach. But it turns out that prior to his corporate career, Lou actually spent some time in the public sector. So he spent 10 years in the New York City government before going into working with Coach. And for 3 of those years, he served as commissioner of the Agency for Child Development and helped restore New York's Head Start and daycare programs during the fiscal crisis of the mid-1970s. And so he has a very interesting background. I think he'll be able to bring a lot of perspective to the conversation that we have been having here thus far. So I am a professor here in the management division. I teach the leadership class to our MBA students. So as soon as the MBA students arrive here at Columbia, they take this leadership course. And the leadership course is designed to really challenge the students to think about what they can do to continue to grow as leaders. We cover topics like decision-making, influence, how to work effectively in teams. We talk about the issues of diversity and inclusion in that conversation. We talk about culture and the importance of shaping a culture. And we talk about how people are influenced by the environments that they find themselves in. Earlier today, we heard some conversation about ethical decision-making, right? We heard about how difficult sometimes it might be to make the right decision. And in the leadership course, we talk about ethics in every single class that we meet. We talk about how ethics comes in to decision-making issues, how it comes into the issue of influence and actually using your power over other people. We talk about how it influences how you interact with others who are different from yourself, right? How you treat people who are them versus us. And so this topic of ethical decision-making is one that we have heard talked about a lot here today, and I want to just ask as a first question to Lou and Kesha to kind of think a little bit about ethical decision-making and how their own careers have been influenced or how they have actually grown through their careers around this issue of ethical decision-making. Are there examples that you can share with us where perhaps you may have faced an issue that ethical decision-making came up? Or even kind of sharing with us how, as you've gone through your career, how it's become more or less of a question for you, right? This question of ethical decision-making.
Well, for me, and I think Kathy and I had a pre-discussion, and I'm on my way. We're investing in companies that are generating 5, 10. One of our companies will generate $20 million this year. And so we're looking forward to that, to the $1 billion number. But as we get there and try to get there, the unique aspect of the types of companies that we invest in is that they have committed to an inherent social mission within that company, whereby the mission of the company really does drive revenue. So for example, a company that we're invested in, Maven. It's an e-commerce platform for hairstylists to sell products directly to their customers. That's the company that will generate close to $20 million this year. And inherent in that model is the idea of doing right by that hairstylist, right? If you're paying them a commission check, you're paying that commission check on time, and it's consistent. And the larger mission of the company is, can you redistribute essentially income in a supply chain that these hairstylists have been participating in for years, but has not received, quote unquote, sort of their fair share of the pie. And so sort of inherent in the business models that we're investing in and the entrepreneurs, we call them, for sort of lack of better words, conscious capitalists, they have a duty to their stakeholders, their end consumers, to provide an alternative product or service that's better than what they are currently receiving, and to do so in a way that's actually enhancing the well-being of that individual. So what we are trying to do as early stage investors is push that button a little more, and whether that requires us creating side letters where we want our companies to look annually, as much attention as they give to strategic planning, they also think about the impact that they're having on key stakeholders. So we're trying to build in, sort of inherently build in, quote unquote, ethics or ethical behavior early on in the company, with the understanding that if we get that right, ideally that creates a competitive advantage as this company grows. Lou?
I'm thinking that there's many ways for me to approach the subject of ethics, and if we define ethics as a set of behaviors that are consistently demonstrated that conform to a level of socially responsible conduct. What I would offer is that I think I'll offer the following. First, a lot of how a company is going to be shaped even before the culture is formed if we're discussing new companies, is really based upon the mission of the company and the values of the founder. And to try to, and if the mission of the company is strictly, when you cut through everything, to maximize profit, and that often occurs in financial services. Yes, there's missions about delivering superior, unequaled services, but if you're measuring your success by the amount of profit that as a major determinant, it drives the culture one way. If you measure success by building a lasting franchise, consumer loyalty, a superior product, competitive advantage that can give people lower prices, a lower priced proposition, you'll shape your culture differently. And for myself, I'm a value-driven person. When I came, after I left Columbia Business School, I chose to spend the first part of my career thinking it might be my entire career in public service. And I wondered, as I was moving to, quote, the private sector, not knowing the difference between an invoice and a packing slip at the time, was whether I would need to compromise my values at Coach, my inherent values of treating people with respect, treating people the way you would like to be treated, being fair to all of the constituents. And in a private company, there's basically 4 constituencies. There's the shareholders, there's the consumers, there's I'm sorry, there's the shareholders, there's the consumers, there is the community, and there are the employees. And looking at each of these four constituent groups and trying to align how are you going to conduct yourself in a way that is consistent across all of these groups. And I found, while I was asked many times to compromise what I felt was right for one or more of these groups, I declined to do so. In one instance, when Coach was part of the Sara Lee Corporation, I was asked by a much more senior person to begin to sell Coach bags into J.C. Penney. It just comes to mind, and the reason for that was because Hanes had very large underwear and hosiery divisions that did hundreds of millions of dollars with J.C. Penney, and they were very insistent that they get the Coach brand. And I knew that was not in the interest of the brand. It would erode the differentiation of the brand. And I declined to do this, and I was threatened with dismissal if I did not go along. And again, I exercised what we would call professional courage, and I said, if you're going to do this, I'm out of here. And they backed off. That's a very small example. Trying not to compromise on materials or quality of product is fundamentally critical. As we began to manufacture in third world countries, we were one of the first manufacturers that sent our teams into multiple countries, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, and we required that they conform to United Nations guidelines in terms of dormitories, living conditions, wages, where we were before we would make our product. It's often very hard to do that because you have because at some point, sometimes when we talk about the four constituencies, you might be compromising short-term profit with investors based on what you believe is the long-term integrity of the business. And by coincidence, last Thursday, 2 days after the presidential election, I was honored by Coach when they dedicated the atrium of our new building to me, and there were about 800 or 900 people in the audience, and I would suspect, other than a handful, everyone was miserable that Trump was elected. Miserable, including me. And in fact, and I know this because on my way in, many people stopped me and asked me different questions. How can this affect us on this island? Aren't we going to be aliens and all of that? And what I said to the team, because it was so out there, that we're a value-driven company and that we have set our own code of behavior. And we are a microcosm of the best of America. We are egalitarian in our approach. We're a meritocracy in the way we approach people. And no matter who is president, it will not change how we conduct ourselves. And we need to be true to who we are. And there's no compromise. And I know that's been a message many other, let's say many sitting CEOs have given to large groups of populations. For example, Howard Schultz in Starbucks in Seattle, where he was very openly pro-Hillary. So to let people know that the world will go on, and we will adapt, and we will move on, and we will have a chance in 4 years, and we need to stay true to who we are. And I'm not sure I'm answering your question in a direct way. I'm just giving it from my personal experience.
Yeah, I mean, this is great. Earlier we were talking a little bit about Wells Fargo. It came up, organization that very clearly has had people engaging in unethical behavior. And the question always comes up of what is the responsibility of the individual in a situation like that, and what's the responsibility of the organization? So Kesha, I want to ask you to chat a little bit about how, with the businesses that you're starting, how are you guys talking about this issue? Are you explicit about how the organizations are shaping themselves to create an environment that encourages ethical behavior, or do you leave it to the leaders of that company? What shapes that in those situations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, it's really, Lucy touched upon just your personal value set and being very clear about that, your personal ethics in terms of business and being very clear about that, and it's sort of that intangible that when we look at the criteria, the types of entrepreneurs that we invest in, these are entrepreneurs that we trust. And as we're walking through Lucy's keynote about why do we trust people, a lot of those factors are, we think when the rubber meets the road and there's a fork in the road, that they will make the right decision. And we only know, God only knows what will happen and how this business will evolve and the challenges that they face. But we're investing in leaders that we think are thoughtful about decision making. They're honest in how they make these decisions. They truly want to do the right thing by their key stakeholders. And in addition to building a large company, these are also entrepreneurs that are passionate about the economic and social issues in the world. So when you couple all that together, you hope that, again, when that tough decision has to be made, they're rooted with such values and the ethics is really a part of their core and how they operate, that's manifested in the decision-making process. So it's the founders we're happy to be partnering with these founders, and they allow us to invest in their businesses. And so we're not telling them to do one thing or the other. We know that their intent is good, and as they operate their business and grow their business, they will do the right thing. And to be honest, I'm the preacher, and I'm glad to sit next to you, and with the values that you have, and that we believe if we get this part right, these companies, as they grow and they become large competitors, they will be the chosen company for the consumer. So for us, it's a business proposition also that from an ethical standpoint, a mission-driven standpoint, that the core of that business is, it's doing right by its key stakeholders.
You want to chime in on that too?
I'm thinking a few different things. First, in established companies like Coach, we have hotlines, and they go to the general counsel, not to the CEO. They go to the general counsel, and the general counsel, the way we have set things up at Coach is that we have a governance committee, and we have and that also has an ethics role, and based on who's involved, our general counsel is not able to share with senior management if there's an issue that is surfaced, and they're required to report it to a committee of the board that doesn't include me, did not include me. And I set it up that way. So most companies don't do that. Most companies follow the shadow of the leader, and there's no substitute, as you're saying, for having the right leaders in place, because no matter what rules of engagement one sets up, there is very strong peer, social, and business pressure to conform to the behavioral norms that are in that entity. We always prided ourselves, and I know the Coach team still does, as a learning organization, and very frequently very senior people would come to me and show me a deal they negotiated. It could be a general manager negotiating an acquisition or a long-term deal with a leather supplier and feeling really good about it. And I look at it, and there's no room for profit for the other person. And I would say that's a terrible deal. It's awful. And the person first time around would turn red. And I would say, we're looking for long-term trusting relationships. And many of these are in third world countries where we're manufacturing or buying supplies. And we're not looking, and it's a learning process. And so much depends on the nature of the organization. And I don't know how I would behave if I was in a financial services organization, because when I look at the behavior of our leading financial institutions that led to the subprime mortgage crisis, it is the types of things that were done and condoned are so outside of anything within my context, it's unfathomable. But again, I come from a world where you produce a physical product. And when you don't produce a physical product, but a set of services and related, it's much harder to maintain a moral compass when you're in a highly competitive world. But I found that behavior abhorrent.
And we're just to add to that, we're also, as early stage investors, and these companies are early stage, trying as best we can to think ahead of the game, right? How can we possibly mitigate some risk of quote unquote bad behavior now, and not from the CEO side or necessarily the company side. I think someone touched on it earlier regarding Facebook. We recently led around in a company, Rojo, that's aggregating spiritual content online. And he's basically, bringing in a number of preachers, starting with the black church, and it'll be global one day. But these preachers obviously have varying opinions about different political, social issues. And what I discovered as I listened to the majority of those sermons on the platform, that they were fine, right? We can provide our opinion, and it's a great thing. And if you believe it, you believe. If you agree, if you don't. But there is a fine line between that and what we discovered in this election, some would call it hate speech, right? And so how are we being very careful in these early days of making sure we have the proper vetting system in place to flag, identify, vet, and then remove, if we need to remove, anything that's deemed to be hate speech. Now, the problem with hate speech, there's no universal, that we found, there's not a universal definition of hate speech. So we did our homework. What's Facebook doing? What's YouTube doing? What are these online platforms? To your point, it's not a physical product, and there's this gray area between what you deem as hate speech may be very different than what I deem as hate speech, but trying our best to early on put some criteria around that so that there is some process in place, and at some point, really to the point that Lucy was making, there has to be a stake in the ground as to what's right and wrong, right? We can't live in this gray area successfully. So that becomes a really exciting part for the work that we're doing, because these companies are so young. We can have some influence as the company grows, and hopefully it really becomes, like Coach, is within the DNA of how this company operates, and that's what's expected at the end of the day.
That's beautiful. I'm going to turn our conversation a little bit, because it came up in both of your comments, kind of this question of what has been happening given the politics that we have seen here in the U.S. in particular, but really all over the world. We're kind of seeing some of this. So last week we had an event at the school where we talked about populism, and Dean Glenn Hubbard and Professor Ray Horton, which I'm sure some of you may remember with fondness. They sat in front of an audience of students and talked about kind of the rise of populism and kind of the populist movements that are taking shape right now in the U.S. So, and the question I think I have here is, as we think about the role of business, and that's what this conference is about, it's kind of the role of business. What do we as business leaders, as people who are working in business organizations, what is our role in terms of shaping the dialogue, the conversation, given the current kind of changes in politics? And we see the leaders that we have talking about hate speech, talking about, you're using these words here that you just used. These are the people that are going to be in these leadership positions. what can we do? Right? What can we do? Do we in fact have a role, and how do we empower people to do something about it? Do you have a perspective on this? It sounds like you guys have both been thinking about it a lot and kind of been dealing with it. Lou, how about we let you go first this time?
Okay. Well, I mentioned it indirectly. It first starts with the business and the constituencies that you have influence over. So at companies where I have a strong role, or in the case of Coach where it was a specific opportunity, you reinforce the values that you have that have brought you to where you are today. And you say that we're going to continue, no matter what goes on outside, to live by our code of conduct. We will be positive. We will be inclusive. We will be collaborative. And you reinforce those values, and you don't allow any suggestion of anything else to slip in. So first it starts at home. And I think that's really important. And many corporate leaders, I cited one, but many corporate leaders across America did video calls, sent emails, had town hall meetings, talking about the world will go on. We have, and whether you agree or not, we have a new reality. We need to be true to who we are. So I think most important is to try to have the type of influence, maintain who you are yourself. And second is to avoid the temptation to slip into behaviors that, in terms of supporting legislation, administrative code changes, that becomes populist driven. Because what Trump is going to do, as Obama did, he will have in his inaugural address 11 points, 27 points, and he's going to talk about his agenda. And there's going to be many things within his agenda that will impact all of America. And to the extent that we can have a say on certain of these things, we need to express it if we're in disagreement, whether it's around reducing and eliminating regulations. Some financial oversight regulations are wasteful, others are absolutely necessary. And trying not to allow, when you typically have a populist leader who, and in this case, most don't have ideology. And Donald Trump is one of them, so he's okay with gay marriage because it's code. But he's not okay with women's rights, yet on the inherent inconsistency doesn't disturb him. So he could flip on a lot of issues, but they tend to. My expectation is, unless there's some governors put on Trump by the people he brings in around him, he's going to try to use a broad paintbrush to change things when you might need a few thinner brushes. And be careful to keep those things that are important. And that's one of the things that frequently occurs if you study what has occurred in other countries with sweeping change. The good is also, the universal good, where even even someone who's a populist, if the right person can explain, if that person has adequate listening skills, that person can explain why that part should be maintained.
Kesha, you have something on your mind you want to share in response to that? If not, then I want to make sure that we get a couple questions from the audience, because I just looked at my watch. I'm like, wow, it's already 2 o'clock.
I'll add that because of the work that we do, we're mission-driven investors. Most of all of our investors are quite progressive. We have wealthy, large families who invested in our fund. So we are, there's a certain burden now that I feel like we're carrying, that we've I'm sure always carried, but people are reaching out, does this change the work that you're doing? What does this mean for low-income people? What does this mean for people of color? And of course, we don't know, but we're processing this. And we're thankful that we have a voice at the table with some very large foundations who say they care about the plight of our most vulnerable population in this country, and low-income people. And so it's this, wanting to say something, but not wanting to say necessarily the wrong thing. But I will tell you, being at this conference and sitting next to you and listening to the other speakers, is that, at the end of the day, it's important to stay true to who we are and what we believe in. And I said the other day, at least for African Americans in this country, we've been through a lot. We've survived slavery, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights era. And so from a fear standpoint, I'm not afraid, and I don't expect many other African Americans to be afraid. We're obviously concerned, but what has happened in the past and the part of my role in this is that oftentimes you have to build ecosystems around systems of oppression, and around systems that aren't fair to you. So I think now is the time where individuals, private capital, really should and need to and will hopefully step up to build the systems that we need to ensure that everyone in this country actually has access to upward mobility.
Absolutely. Okay, let's open it up to questions. Those of you out there, you have any questions you want to ask Kesha and Lou? Everybody's dead now. There's a question in the back.
Excuse me.
Hi, I really appreciate all three of you, and thanks for what you've already shared. I think it's great. I think you've talked a lot about sort of top-down inclusive leadership and setting a tone. As MBA students, obviously, we have a lot of privilege, but we're also sort of in a little bit of a precarious place where we're looking for jobs at the companies, and we're trying to see what signals are that we could be safe, right? Like, as someone in the LGBT community, will I be safe? And I know my peers are thinking, will we be safe, or will we be included in the companies that we're going to work for?
So, I think the question here is kind of what kind of advice might you be able to give to, let's say, our current MBA students who are going and looking for organizations where they, kind of will find what they're looking for to make sure that they can have influence and that they can be a part of the organizations that they're seeking. I think Lou's comments about Coach and how transparent they are about the values of the organization is one of the things that is critically important, that you really do try to find out what is it really like for people like you in that company and what the values of the organization are. But I don't know if you have more to kind of say to that.
I speak frequently to young people who are looking for their first opportunity, and what I frequently ask them is, what would they like a workplace to offer them, or what would they like to gain from their first role? What would success look like, so that I could tailor my comments to what that person might be looking for, because people are motivated by different things. For a value-driven person who is looking for a market, let's say an ecosystem, an environment that represents the most inclusive values, you need to do a lot of homework to understand with all four of the constituencies, how do they behave? And that includes speaking with existing employees and former employees. It includes understanding the products and the services they provide to customers. What do they give back to the community? And most important is the relationship that you're going to have with a prospective direct superior and the department that you're in, because many large companies, notwithstanding an overall strong corporate culture, because many larger companies are so large, there are, of course, microcultures, and the cultures within certain lines of business or certain functions are different than others. And it's a challenge that large companies that have diverse business lines, whether it's a GE or Disney or an Amex, they go through, and how do you try to ensure that the values in a far-flung, diversified company are consistent with the values that the corporate values, and sometimes they're not. So one needs to be careful and very discerning.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Another question? One over here from Lucy. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you all for your insightful discussions. I still want to come back to this point around how we keep people true. Because we're still very much in a world of incentives, right? And we've all been educated that it's all about the right incentives. And I do believe it's possible to have soft incentives. If as a community or as a society we frown upon certain things, people will be incentivized to behave themselves. But given the context in which we're in generally now, particularly when you talk about social impact organizations, which perhaps I'm not too familiar with the inner workings of, how do the incentives ensure that people continue to do the right thing? Or is it possible? Or is it that the whole model that we've been taught for years and years around incentives should be thrown out, and we need to use a different way of getting people to behave the way we need them to behave?
It's a great question. For us, the way that we hope we can prove this out, because it really does address this point around incentives. So the types of companies that we invest in are mission-driven companies. The do-good aspect of that directly aligns with revenue and profit, right? And so if a large investor or an acquirer wanted to buy one of our companies, ideally, and I probably shouldn't say this in public, but ideally what would happen is that if they were to strip out that the essence of the company that makes that company a mission-driven or an impactful company, it would break the business model, right? And so we're being intentional and deliberate about only investing in companies whereby the mission of that company drives the growth of that company, and anything other than that mission, and that mission will, deviate and variate and twist and turn as the company grows, but the core of the mission is what makes that company what it is. If that changes, then the model essentially breaks. And so we'll see if we can prove that out. But we do, our goal is to prove by doing good what that thing is. Once you hone in on what that good piece is, ideally for the companies we're investing in, it drives the growth of that company.
I'm going to answer your question from a different approach. In terms of incenting people, I think it all starts with the people that you recruit who pass your screens. And we put in the businesses where I have say, we put a very strong premium on values of integrity, work ethic, transparency, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, commitment, and we filter positive energy, positive intent. I think it's very hard if people are not centered in terms of who they are, or they're easily movable, to put in a set of controls or governors to prevent people from misbehaving. We also we have a lot of coaching and learning and development, and we help people become more conscious so that they can be more effective and more consistent. And it's a never-ending process of work. So it all starts with how do you cast for the team, and where do you put values? We screen against values before we screen against capabilities, Because if we think someone's not going to be what we would call a culture fit, we work really hard not to allow ourselves to tell ourselves a story why we should make an exception for this technologist or this finance person. Because when we do make an exception, it often doesn't work.
And just to add a little bit to that, what we do call the one criteria we have for our entrepreneurs and for ourselves is, are they culturally competent, right? Do they know enough about the people that they're looking to serve to make sure they are doing right by that community? What you may think is good for a community that you're unfamiliar with may actually harm that community. So what Lou is talking about, this consciousness, it's that intangible thing, but you know it when you know it and you see it, is so important when you're talking about mission-driven work in our case.
This is great. I mean, I think what we've heard here today is that we absolutely have to keep our eye on the ball with this, that you can't assume that that it's just going to work itself out, that you actually have to shape the organization, to shape the importance of those values, to build it into every aspect of what you do in the organization, from the moment you select people in, to the training that you put them through, to the job that they're doing every day, to the culture that you're creating, to the ways that you are incentivizing, to the people that you hold up on a pedestal in your organization. All of those things have to be thought about, you know, and to be aligned with the values, so that people are in fact incentivized to do the right thing, so that they can be the one who's held up on that pedestal. And so when we see someone like Lucy Quist, and we see someone like Kesha Cash, and we see someone like Lou Frankfurt, who is at the top of these organizations, who's leading, it's really important for us to create opportunities for their voices to be heard. Because the reality is, it's these voices, right, the expression of these values that actually can, in fact, have an influence on what's happening in those environments. We try to do that here at Columbia Business School as well. Right. The importance of who do we hold up on a pedestal, who are the people that we say are the values that we want people to espouse to. What do we do to enforce that in our culture? What do we do to enforce that in our structures? What do we do to enforce it in our environment? And so I think it, in fact, you know, each one of us has some power to have an influence on that. Right? Each one of us has some power to pat the person on the back who's doing the right thing, to actually, you know, encourage them to continue to do the right thing. I think each of us has some influence in that. So I hope that the conversation that we've had today here with this panel in particular, but also just all the conversations that we've had today, kind of encourages each of us to realize that there's something that we can individually do, even when we might think that things are not going the way we want them to. All right, so I think we're at the point where we might have a couple of closing remarks. Glenn Hubbard is here. Thank you so much for being here, Glenn. Let's give the round of applause.
Thanks, guys.